So for pros, we said it was really nice because you can see kind of like the baseline where your students are at. So if you opt to like test to see what they, like if they learned what they were supposed to last year, you can see if they did, or if they didn't, maybe you have to recover it. At the same time, you could also use a pretest to look for different misconceptions that the students have. And finally, it kind of gives you a way to look at how your students have progressed throughout like the unit or whatever. If maybe they knew nothing about it at the end, or at the beginning, but at the end they now have it mastered, you can see that using the test and retest method.
For cons, it's strictly only testing content and a student's like knowledge of such, so just kind of straight facts in a way. So you can't see like growth of them as a person, or maybe how they feel about the classroom, because it could also just be how well they learn the textbook. It also, because they happen each, like the test and the retest happen each on one day, if they're having a bad day or anything else, and all the other factors that play into that, you might not, there's always like things that could skew that data. Students might not also be good test takers. There's some who just don't sit well and sit there and do like paper pencil tests. So if you're strictly only testing them in one way and they're not good at that way, then that's also going to skew your data of what their knowledge actually is.
Good. Some people like to have the hard data, right? The students scored 43% on the pretest and 91% on the post-test, and look how much they grew. And there's nothing wrong with that. But as you pointed out, there are pluses and minuses to that. That's why I asked for your show of hands earlier about the teacher that maybe is having a major impact on their classes, but you might not see it in the test scores. And you know where the most common places where that happens? Honors classes. Know why? Why? Well, they're smaller, yes. Yeah, something else. With this one. They're good at test taking. Who comes into who's in the honors class in the first place? The smart ones who tend to test high, right? So if you come into my honors class on day one and you pre-test 91%, at the end of the year you post-test at 93%, it doesn't look like you learned anything, right? So some of the teachers around the state that are trying to psych out the system here, which is to show the most impact on their classes, are actually asking for some of the lower level classes. Because if I have a student that only does 40% on the pretest, I can show growth. If my student pretests at 91%, I can't really show that they've learned anything this year. And so we got some people in the state that are actually avoiding teaching the honors classes because it's harder for them to prove the students learned anything. Isn't that weird? So I think it is an inherent problem. It's called the ceiling effect, where you sort of have the students are already up here and there's a ceiling slightly above them, and no matter how much they learn in your class, they're just never going to get that much further that the test itself can show. There may be other ways of doing it. Maybe the interviews or open-ended questions or whatever can show it, but the test itself as an instrument might not show that much growth. So sometimes we park ourselves in the back of the classroom and we observe what's going on, maybe using a checklist of things we're looking for. Who is our observation group? Okay.
So we said that it was good that you're getting like a first-hand experience of it, so you're not relying on other people's opinions where you could get bias. And then it's also like concrete objectives, so either people like did them or they didn't. So you're not going to get any bias that way where you like feel like they did something or didn't.
For disadvantages, it's not very detailed, and there might not be things on it, because it usually says like, did this person do it or not like what they didn't do. And there's no place to opinion or to get feedback on it. It's just a simple checklist.
Okay, good. So it's kind of this naturalistic, here's what I see going on in the classroom. But I'm not going to be able to get the opinion. If I'm going to get the opinion of how the student feels about it, learned from it, reacted to it, etc., I'm going to have to go further than just watching them. I'm going to have to talk to them, I'm going to survey them, something to find out what their reaction is. But this is a good one, particularly, again, good teachers do this all the time, right? You have some kind of a formal thing. What are you looking for? I'm constantly on the case of my method students, that when they will say things like, well, I'm going to observe my students, I'm going to say, what are you observing? What are you looking for? Or they'll say, I walk around the class and talk to my students. What are you going to talk to them about? What are you going to ask them? What are you looking for? You know, so just sitting there and watching the students may not be enough. And even if you have a checklist of things you're looking for, if you really want to know how the students are reacting and what they're thinking, you're going to have to go to some other method to make that happen. Okay, good. So sometimes we have students write in journals, or we give them a writing prompt that they can write on and hand in. And we use those journal entries to think about how they're perceiving things.
Some of the pros that we came up with is students they act in a primary source, so you get the direct feedback like from the students. You get their experiences, and depending on how the question is, it's kind of a big what if. You can probe the students and ask them why, or you can just have it just a general question. So it's kind of up in the air depending on how the question is.
Our comments were that it's qualitative data, so you have to interpret everything, and you could interpret it differently than the student intended. And it can be biased, as well as time consuming. It takes a lot of time, not only for the students to rate it, but for you to go back and go through them and go analyze what you have.
Good, good. Very time consuming. I mean, imagine if you have, remember that when we first started this course off, I described for you one of my former students who did this, and she did journal writing, and she had her students write in that journal every day for like 2 weeks in a row, and she had 25 students in her class. So if you write in the journal every day, she's got 250 journal entries to read. That takes a lot of time, not only to read them, but then to start to code them and figure out what are students saying, what are the patterns, stuff like that. So, by the way, this is just kind of an interesting note about our program here. That student that I told you about, I don't know if I told you that she was the president of the Ohio Council of Teachers of Math a few years ago. She was the youngest president ever to serve, and she was a BGSU grad, which was kind of cool. So I'm in Washington, D.C. last week working at NCTM, and I'm in the middle of a project, and they hired a new person at NCTM in charge of professional development for high school math teachers in the country. And her job at NCTM is to coordinate PD workshops in regional and national conferences. BG grad. I taught her 10 years ago. How cool was that? She walks out of her office. I looked at her, Kristen? Dr. Brahier? Holy cow, how did you end up here? She's been all over. She taught in Arizona, she taught in Virginia, ended up back at NCTM, and now she's coordinating PD for NCTM. So great things happening from Bowling Green grads. We'd like to see you out there doing the things that you do, and you will all do great things. We'll hear about you. Alexa?
I did a lot of writing clubs in junior high, high school, and if you have a student who isn't very interested in writing a lot,
Yep.
and you're just asking them to write, you're not going to get a lot out of them, regardless, because it's a very self-directed activity. So, but then if you kind of open it up to draw me a picture, do this, it's just more interpretation that you have to do in the long run. And you have to be aware of how much time you're giving the students, because if you ask them to write a journal prompt every day, but it's the last 30 seconds before the bell rings, you're going to get nowhere, and it's just going to be I liked this lesson, I learned 2 words. But if you wanted them to go more in depth, you'd have to take out more of your classroom time. So there's the trade-off of how you do your journal, how much time you give them, how many questions you ask them, and all of that. So it can be a lot of work to set up.
Excellent. I think you bring up a good point too, that some people are more verbal and some are more written, in terms of the way that they like to communicate. So you're going to have a certain number of students in your class that if you interview them, either in a focus group or one-on-one, you ask them questions, you all know people like that, where you say, how you doing? Okay. So how was your day? Okay. Yeah, right. But if you give that person a prompt and you say, tell me what you did today, oh, I didn't like to write. They'll write you a whole page about what went on today, but they're not going to tell you that in person, right? Other people are just the opposite. They just don't want to write, or they can't write. They don't like to write things. But if you talk to them about it, they'll tell you lots of stuff, So I think we take a risk anytime we go kind of with the interviews versus journal writing and writing to prompts, because it depends on what kind of a communicator that person is. Some are more apt to do one, in an ideal world, maybe we give them an option between the two. But then you start to wonder, is is that good? Because now the methodology is a little bit mixed up, because I can't probe here, and I could probe here, and so I'm not really doing exactly the same thing. So there definitely are pluses and minuses there. So sometimes we audio record, and one way that this is typically done is you have a group of students working, say, on they're doing a lab experiment, or they're solving a problem, and you set a recording device in the middle of the table, it can even be an iPad or something, or an iPhone, and let that record the conversation, so that you can then listen to it afterwards and see what kinds of things were being said around that table, because you can't possibly write them all down while that's happening, and that also allows you to move around the room. There are pluses and minuses to that.
So the pros we came up with is that it's quick. You just like set down a device and it starts recording. It's pretty easy and it's not very intrusive, because most audio recording devices are tiny. And like with it being non-intrusive, it doesn't really affect the performance like video recording would, because some people might act differently if they know they're being filmed. If you, after a while, you may not realize that you're going to be recorded anymore. And it's cost efficient because there are so many things you can record with nowadays that you won't have to like, oh, I need to go buy a camera or like something so I can record like this. Does that make sense? Maybe?
So one of the cons we talked about is that it's really difficult to transcribe a group like an audio recording, because it's one, really hard to distinguish people to different voices if it's like a group or a class. But if you need to type it out and you need to have, actual parts of it typed out, it's really hard to do that with an audio recording, and it takes a lot of time. And then another one is that you can't see any nonverbal behavior. There's no nonverbal communication, which is a huge part of communication. Because I can be saying one thing, but it all depends on how I say it is really how I feel. And so you take out a huge part of how students can communicate how they're feeling or behaving. And then there's no like quantitative data, so there's no hard data. It's a lot of just like normal interviews are. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. When you're audio taping somebody, you're not getting necessarily kind of the emotion, the body language, and things in it. That's also a drawback we didn't talk about back here. But the same thing even with journals. Well, actually, you did mention it, that you don't know what the emotion is or how they're saying. You've all sent or received an email at some point in your life, or a text message where you meant one thing and somebody misinterpreted it, or you did, right? I mean, that's an awful feeling. You send somebody a note, you say good job, and they think you're being sarcastic, and then they think you're a jerk, and you didn't mean it that well, or whatever. You can say anything on a text and somebody just doesn't, because that's just words on a page. And when you actually can hear them, you might be able to hear a little bit of the emotion, but maybe not. Maybe you're still not getting that because you don't have some of the nonverbals. So another alternative people use is video recording. So who is our video recording? Okay.
Yep. So yeah, one of the pros we said was being able to see those nonverbal cues. If someone says they really enjoyed your lesson, but the videotape shows them like falling asleep, but obviously now that wasn't the case. You can also like kind of say the general overview. So you might be like focusing on one specific part of your class, but if you videotape the entire class, you can see your general like pedagogy and how that impacts the class for the entire lesson, the entire day. And other pros, you're able to rewatch it. It's an observation. If you miss something, if you don't like see it, then you miss it. But if you videotape it, you can rewatch it over and over again and like pick up on things you might have missed the first time.
Okay, and then for the cons, we have obviously if you're being recorded, you might not act how you would normally act in a class. Also, you need the permission to video record your students, and if you're going to go back and watch it, it's going to take a lot of time to go and watch all the video that you've recorded.
Good. And you're all aware when you are in methods in student teaching, you're going to be doing the EdTPA, right? We talked about that at the last Common Time meeting. And the TPA requires that you video record your lessons. And you put those together, you put two different kind of video clips of about 7 or 8 minutes together, and that's kind of that is representative of your teaching. So you're going to be required to do that as part of your assessment when you're student teaching, is to be able to get good video clips of what's going on in your classroom. And you're going to find that that's kind of a challenge to do. it's hard to get just the right clip, just the right angle, and you get that student that's doing just the right presentation and the sound isn't loud enough, you can't hear what they said.